Hello. This is Derek from One Over Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in the last episode, what I did is I looked at the sourcing of Bilo Chun. This is that really fuzzy, curly green tea from Jiangsu, from Suzhou. And I went all the way to the Dongting Peninsula. I talked about the different kind of agriculture there. I talked about the production, the people making it, exactly how much tea goes into the wok at each time, how much you get out of it. And I really gave the full view of the land, the people, and the processings of this tea. What I want to do in this episode is go one step further and talk about Dragonwell, talk about Longjing. So this is the second leg of my spring tea trip. First, I went to Suzhou. I went to the Biluochuan area. Next, I went to Hangzhou. This is the Longjing, the Dragonwell area, and I get into the mountains of the Mandrelong village, which is nestled right between the Shifeng, the Lion's Peak, and the Baihefeng, the White Crane Peak, where some of the best, absolutely best Longjing comes from. These are the teas that, if you're following our Instagram, you kind of saw the whole process. You saw us getting into the mountains. You saw the prices that these teas are being charged, and they're up in the range of $10,000 for the pound for 500 grams of tea. These are some of the top masters in China, and as I mentioned in the history of Longjing, the reason this tea is so well received, why you can charge so much money for this tea, is because of its long, unbroken history, where it's being praised by everyone from the Qianlong Emperor and spread through all the land of mountains and rivers in China here, and even exported internationally. What I also want to do in this episode is talk about the different production regions in that core region, in that Hexinchu. This is the heart area where the best Longjing comes from, and it's broken up into 5 main parts. These 5 main parts in Chinese are called Shi, Long, Yun, Hu, Mei, which in translation is the lion, the dragon, the cloud, the tiger, and the plum. And the first 4 are really some of the best places for Longjing in the entire world. And you've probably heard of the first one, Shifeng. That's Lion's Peak. The second one, Long, that's Longjing. That's the actual temple of the Longjing temple where the well is, that area, and it's very close to the Shifeng area. The next one is Yun. This is the Yunqi, which means the cloud dwelling. Then we have Hu. This is Hu Pao. This is the running tiger, and it's named after one of the most famous springs in China, the running tiger spring, the Hu Pao Chuan. And this is something I'll talk about later because I actually went there with some friends and we got water from the Hu Pao Chuan. Then we hiked over the mountains to the Mandrelong village and we brewed it with some of my favorite Dragonwell tea makers in the area. And it was just a phenomenal experience. They have this saying, which is something like the West Lake double. And this is when you take the water from this spring, the Running Tiger Spring, and you brew it with Longjing tea, and you brew Longjing tea with this water. And this is just like the idea that everything from this environment feeds itself and it intensifies. And the Longjing brewed with this Running Tiger Spring water is just divine, and it does taste different. We were actually drinking it with my friends, and we ran out of water, and somebody switched the water, and then one of the makers who wasn't paying attention was like, "Oh, did we switch the water?" Just from the taste of the tea. And I was like, wow, that's really impressive. But I'll get back into that later when we talk about the spring itself. So those were the 4 main regions. So that was the dragon, the cloud, the tiger, and the lion. And these 4 are really the true main regions. There's also the 5th one, that's Mei, that's plum, and that's the Meijia Wu. And the Meijia Wu was kind of a late addition to these 4 really core areas. It was kind of during that Republican period when they were trying to get more out of this tea and pushing it onward and onward. And this area, it's not necessarily in the depths of the mountains. It doesn't have the best drainage. It's kind of an afterthought if you're really looking at this core region. And so the teas from the Meijiawu village are significantly less expensive than those of these four main core regions. So for me, even though they say there are the five main regions, really that's further broken up into 80% of the tea in this area is made in the Meijiawu, and then 20% is split between these four really iconic places. Well, that's enough technical information about the specific breakdown of this area in the Westlake of Hangzhou. Let's get into the story a little bit. Let's talk about how I left Suzhou with my tea master and the gang, and we drove a little further south. I think it was only 1.5 hours. It was not very far to this Westlake area, and it was really cool just to see this Westlake area under the wing of my master. And if you listen to the past couple episodes, I talk about my relationship with my tea master, and I kind of foreshadow some of the stuff that's happening in this episode, where my tea master is getting out into these regions and he's introducing me to some of the top makers in the area. And so what we do is we first roll up right into the Manjuelong village. So if you look at Hangzhou, Hangzhou is this really, really, really big city, and it's really, really developed. Big skyscrapers, big buildings, really nice, like fancy cocktail bars, Michelin restaurants. And in China, it's hard to get more famous than Hangzhou. If you think of something like Shanghai or Shenzhen, these are modern cities. 100 years ago, 300 years ago, they didn't exist. And so Hangzhou was an old dynastic capital in the southern Song dynasty, and a lot of poets migrated here. The culture here has just been phenomenal for about 1,000 years. And it has that unbroken history, as I mentioned. And this is what has really helped the Dragonwell itself, the Dragonwell tea catch on. But in my opinion, Hangzhou is equally unique for its deeply rooted historical culture and its really impressive development. In Chinese, the Fajian. Like, it's grown so much because Alibaba, if you're familiar with Alibaba, it's like, the Chinese Amazon, Taobao. All of this is located in Hangzhou. Jack Ma's from that area and stuff, or his company is. And so this has really given Hangzhou a huge amount of, capital, of money, of economy, a lot of people coming into Hangzhou to do this kind of tech development, this designing, and a lot of art going on as well. I had a friend there, his name is Xiao A, little A, and he's a designer in Hangzhou. And he was showing me all of his projects last time I was there. I went to Hangzhou a few times in this trip. I really enjoyed it. But last time I went there, little A showed me a place he had designed. It's a whiskey library. And so you go in there and it looks like a library, but instead of books, you just have whiskey bottles. And he's like, here's the Islay, here's like the Highlands, here's the Lowlands, here's, bourbon. And it's really interesting because the first level is a library, the second floor is a really nice cocktail bar. And so we have a drink there, and then he's like, let me show you another place. And we go into another place, secret door, down into this like really nice, like cool looking speakeasy place. And I'm thinking, like, how can a city have such preserved historical culture and then so much modern culture just living right above it or below it? What I'm getting at here is that Hangzhou is a really interesting city with a huge amount of history and this modern world that's coming in and just being built right on top of it. Literally right on top of it. I'll tell you about when we get into the Manjuelong with my tea master. The first stop we get to is his friend's tea house and production studio, and his friend is, like my tea master, one of these dashers, these big masters, and this is the city sanction, the province sanction. These are really difficult titles to achieve, especially in the Chinese tea world. And so we get into somebody that's at his level, except the difference is he's not making Lu Yangchun or Yanhua Hong. He's making Longjing, and Longjing is worldwide famous. And so this guy, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He has a bit of an ego, but I think it's well-deserved. So, a little context here. It is a few days before Qingmingjie, so it is peak tea season, and driving into the Westlake area from Hangzhou, it's so busy. These are more of those mountain roads that are barely even two lanes, and people are parked on the side of the lanes. And so there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of cars, there's nowhere to park. And my tea master pulls up to a tea house right on the main drag, and he starts like backing in, and he tells me to get out and move a cone so that he can park there. I get out and I start moving the cone, and a lady comes out. She's like, "What are you doing moving this cone?" And I'm like, "I don't know. My master just told me to move it." And she's like, She walks over to the driver's seat and she's like, "Oh, Yin Song, like Master Yin, like what's going on? I haven't seen you in a while. Come in, come in." So we get in there, and they're drinking some of their Dragonwell, and it's beautiful. The shop, it's really like beautiful as in really lived in, really natural, not too ostentatious, which is really nice sometimes to see, especially in such a well-renowned place. And so we get into the tea house, and my tea master is just an old friend of all these people, and they're asking him all these questions. He's looking at, the people's hands because they're covered in blisters, the tea makers around here. And he's waiting for his friend to come in. His friend is Tang Xiaojun, and this is his studio, and he's a top master. And so Tang Xiaojun comes in, and my tea master introduces me to him. He nudges me. He's like, "Stand up, stand up." So I stand up, and I introduce him. In China, usually you don't shake hands. You just kind of like nod to each other and stuff like that. But this guy is international enough. He goes in for a handshake. And the first thing I notice is his hand is just covered in calluses and blisters. And in this world, it's definitely a sign of respect. It's a sign of just all the work that goes into making this tea, touching the hot wok and everything. And the more blisters you have, it's kind of a badge of honor where it's like, I've made so much tea. These are the hands of a tea maker. And this guy immediately just strikes me. He has that presence. He has that confidence. And this is his studio and his world. And so we drink a little bit of the teas, and the teas are incredibly expensive. This is the guy selling his teas for like 80,000 renminbi for the 500 grams, which is over 11,000 US dollars. And so he kind of shows us his plaque. He's very proud of it. And then we walk across the street to his production facility. And what's really interesting about this is what I was just mentioning about Hangzhou with Shao'e, where the old city, the new city is built on top of the old city. So we go across the street, and there's this, in Chinese they call it the Da Ka Dian, like a place you go to check in. It's a really hip place, really nice architecture, and just filled with beautiful people taking glamour selfies of themselves sitting outside in the trees, drinking their coffee, drinking their tea, and just everyone's posing. They're professional cameramen, and it's just a coffee house, but it's become like a place to go to take photos. And so we walk there, and I'm like, this is really weird if this is his production studio. And then we go into the basement of this place, and in this basement of this place is the guy's workshop, which is so just absolutely wild to see, like these two worlds just mesh together, one sitting right on top of the other. We get into the production studio, and he's showing me around. He's telling me all about the Tanglian, how long and he says the Tanglian is not withering. He's showing me all the tea in the racks on like the screens that it is technically withering, but he says it's not withering. It's losing some of its water content so that the green can be killed in the wok. I'll go more deeply into the full production later. In this time, I'm just giving you the measure of this guy in his studio, and he's telling me all about his teas and what makes his teas in this region and this terroir different. And so he's asking me, I hate this question. He asked me when I was in his workshop, when I was in his tea house, I drank the teas, what did I think of them? And as soon as this question hits me, I'm just like, I have no idea. My brain shuts down, and I'm like, it tasted good. But really what I'm supposed to say is like, oh, it's like spring rain on orchids. I could taste the natural, like, the sweetness of flowers. And, I'm supposed to kind of wax poetic. But again, this is in Chinese. My Chinese is fairly conversational, but it doesn't quite get to this level of jargon and poetic jargon with like the tasting notes. So I just kind of blank out there. And he's just like, well, you'll come around to it. And so he's showing me all these different things, like the fresh leaves, and he takes the fresh leaves, has me smell them, and then has me eat one of the leaves. And I eat the leaf, and he's like, what do you taste? And instantly it's really bitter and astringent. Not astringent, it's drying. So my mouth gets really, really dry. But I'm in that supposed to flatter this guy mode, so I'm like, oh, it tastes a little sweet, and he kind of laughs, and he's like, okay, tell me how it tastes in about 2 minutes, and I'm like, okay, and it's like my mouth is incredibly dry, and we start walking through the studio. I'm looking at a few other things, and all of a sudden, my mouth starts flooding with口水. It sounds better in Chinese. Flooding with saliva. I start salivating, and it's all of a sudden everything becomes really sweet. And I look over it, and I'm like, wow. Suddenly my mouth is full of sweetness. He's like, that's the first secret. And I'm like, interesting. And so it's just like, because I've eaten fresh leaves, fresh buds from other regions, like in the Pu'er region, you can eat the fresh gushu, and usually eating the leaf, the amount of bitterness you get tells you a little bit about the age of the tea, age of the tree sometimes, or if it's a really old tree. And I did this in the Wudong Mountains too, with one of the mother bushes. I ate a leaf and there was no bitterness. I was really, really impressed by that. And so I eat this, and there's a lot of bitterness with it. But it turns into this incredible salivating sweetness. And this is one thing that Tang Xiaojun says that makes this terroir specific for the Dragonwell. Of course, I'm going to have to go eat a lot of other tea buds to see if that's true or not. But I start walking through the studio with him, and I'm asking him all the questions. Tang Lian, this is the not withering but softening up the cell walls. It's definitely not oxidizing. But the tea leaves are picked and then placed on these screen mats and left to cool for a while, and then it's kill greened. And I'm asking him specs about the kill green. I'm like, how hot is the wok? He's like, yeah, it depends on the tea, on the day, on the maker. And I'm like, okay, how long do you do it for? He's like, yeah, it really still depends on the ambient moisture temperature, the day of the pick. And he's like, as soon as you put rules to something, it's no longer art. It's no longer a craft. It becomes mechanical. And you have to pay attention to all of these differences. And so there is no right answer when making tea. And I'm like, okay, you sound like this is what I would expect out of a master, right? Somebody who's like, well, it's all art. There's never any real answer to anything that you're asking about. But what I'm trying to do is just trying to find like a framework, and he still won't give it to me. It's very, very stubborn master kind of stuff. I love it. The way his studio is set up, though, is he has 2, 3, 4 to 6 walks. And then he has apprentices working there. And these are his specific apprentices that are making his handmade tea. And this handmade tea gets sold for probably about 8,000 US dollars for 500 grams. It's just the right location, made under the right master by the apprentice. His teas, on the other hand, are almost unbuyable. Like it makes such a small amount, and then is really selective on who he sells it to. Like my tea master could probably buy some, but I probably could not buy any of the teas that he makes, not even for any amount of money. He just wouldn't let me buy them. And this kind of holds true all throughout China with all master-produced things. Really what you need is you need guanxi, you need inroads, and at a point it becomes you're almost too famous to sell your own products. Like this is like in Chaozhou, Xiehua, the big master. And people, what's great about these big masters is they all kind of know each other. Like the people in Hangzhou and the Manzhuilong, they all know Xiehua. And then Xiehua probably knows some of these. And the Xiehua teapots, I probably can't buy. Even though I know Xiehua, he just like makes so few actual pots himself that he just doesn't really sell them or doesn't really want to sell them. Anyways, talking about the masters that all know each other, this guy, Tang Xiaojun, I went to Linsang, Pu'er, about 100 kilometers in the west, and I was going to Bingdao. I have a friend in Bingdao who sells this Danju Gushu tea, and it's just incredibly expensive, but his prices are very similar to Tang Xiaojun's. And I was there, and this guy was like, hey, I saw you went to Tang Xiaojun's studio. And I'm like, really? You saw that? He's like, yeah, you posted a picture on your WeChat moments. And I'm like, I did. You know him? He's like, yeah, we're pretty old friends. I've known him for a long time. And I'm like, that's really cool. Like, the higher you get up into this world, the more people kind of know each other. And so after the tour of his studio, we leave. And we're standing outside in the courtyard where everyone's taking glamour selfies. And he's just kind of starting to explain to me what he's doing here, how long he's been here, what the quality of the teas he's making. And he asked me, he's like, have you ever been to Hangzhou before? Have you ever looked at Dragonwell? I'm like, yeah, I came here once in 2017. And he's like, well, you're at the freaking top now. I'm just like, wow, that's just the most like kind of like ego powerful statement to say. Like he drew the outline of a mountain and touched the top. He's like, you're at the freaking top right now. You've made it here thanks to your master. And I'm like, but at the same time, like it kind of all checks out. So I'm not like canceling this guy for being arrogant or anything. It's kind of like an arrogance that's well deserved and something you kind of need to have in this area, because I'll tell you, we went to another studio right after this, and the guy's name is also Tong. And I was like, oh, are they brothers? And he's like, my tea master's like, they're not necessarily brothers, but if Tong Xiaojun is like the DE Ming, the number one, then this guy is a very close number two. And it's like literally across the street as well. And so we go into his studio, and he has a much larger production facility, much larger as in 12 walks instead of only 6. And he has a lot of apprentices all making tea, all talking, all gossiping, and he's sitting at the table smoking cigarettes and drinking tea. This guy's demeanor is incredibly chill. He's very relaxed, very just at ease, and he makes very good teas. His teas are a little more traditional than that of Tang Xiaojun. Tang Xiaojun's teas are just immaculate, beautiful, the leaf shape, the leaf quality, the withering that he doesn't call withering, everything like that, the sorting. This other Tang Hejun, his teas are a lot more natural. The leaf shapes are a little different. Sometimes they're not perfectly oval. And his goal here is to make the highest quality taste, not the prettiest leaf, but the best tasting tea. And so he'll leave in pieces that other people would probably want to sift out or pull out or something like that. But his main thing, in addition to being natural, having the natural feeling of the tea, he says, no flower, no Longjing. And the meaning here is that if it doesn't have this very unique floral fragrance to it, it's not truly handmade Westlake Dragonwell green tea. And this is really interesting as somebody coming from the West, because we always think Dragonwell tea should have that chestnut aroma or chestnut taste or something like that. But really, the truly handmade stuff from this core region should be much more floral, like the fragrance of orchids or something like that. And that's something I've definitely noticed when comparing teas from this region and teas outside of this region. And stay tuned, because I will release a little sampler on the One River Tea website that has teas from just across the river in Qiantang, teas from the Meijiawu maybe, teas from the village, teas that are entirely handmade, teas that are half handmade, and then just give you guys an experience to compare. Can you really taste the differences? And is the tea made at Baihe Feng, all handmade, worth 60 times the tea that's machine made from an extra regional location? Anyways, that's a new project I'm working on. It's already May, and I'm pretty late on it because it's all Ming Qian stuff, but it should be coming out later this year. And so I find this idea that no flower, no Dragonwell is really interesting, because before coming here, I hadn't really heard of it. I hadn't really thought about it. I'd always thought good Dragonwell should have that chestnut taste to it, and this stuff still did. But another really interesting thing about this, as I was drinking tea, the first brew is like essentially colorless, has this like really nice fragrance, a little sweet. The second brew is all right as well. And then as soon as that third brew hits, about a minute or 2 minutes, 3 minutes after we start drinking, all of a sudden my mouth is full of saliva and everything's really sweet. And I think about the leaf I ate, just like the hour ago. And I'm like, wow, this really is the secret. This is a really truly phenomenon that's happening to me again and again, drinking these really high quality core region Longjing teas. One is that orchid fragrance. One is that incredible sweetness, salivating sweetness that happens a few minutes after I start drinking or eating these teas. So we got to Hangzhou maybe around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. Now it's like 6:30, 7 o'clock. And we've been drinking a whole lot of teas, and I'm getting pretty hungry. So my tea master takes us over to a third tea house where we actually end up eating some food. And this tea house turns out to be my favorite tea house. It's called Nine Trees. Jiushu, and it's a little further up on the road on the Manjuelong Road. And we get in there, and similar to Tang Hejun's studio, where he has a lot of apprentices making tea, I see a lot of people in green, classical green shirts making teas outside in these walks, and they're all just chatting, they're all talking. It seems like a very nice environment. We get in, and the tea house is just packed. There's like not even any room to sit down. And my tea master gets in there, and everyone's like, "Wow, Yinwei, hey, it's been so long. How are you doing? How are you doing?" And he's just like laughing, offering people cigarettes and stuff like that. It's by the way, the offering of cigarettes is so common in China, especially in the tea world and the tea mountains. It's a sign of respect. It's a social contract. It's like, now we're friends. Let me give you this. Let me give you this. Every time you see somebody, you give them a cigarette. It's so popular. I think in the West, we've kind of become a little sensitive to cigarettes and stuff like that. But you have to understand different culture, different things, different country. And so it's incredibly popular for people to be smoking at the tea house, smoking while drinking tea, offering the tea makers cigarettes and stuff like that. So anyways, we go through that social dance of cigarette offering, and then we just go right upstairs, and in another tea room, they have the table all laid out for dinner, and people are just eating. So we sit down there, and we finally start eating, and it everything tastes so good because I'm so hungry. But I think they had that classic Hangzhou food. Some of the Hangzhou food is like the Dongpo roll, which is this type of braised beef in red sauce, and it's named after a famous poet. This is the Su Dongpo. That was his pen name. His real name was Su Shi, and Su Shi was one of the most famous poets in the Northern Song Dynasty period. This is like 1100s, before the Mongols invaded and the capital was moved to Hangzhou. Before that, Su Shi used to come to Hangzhou a whole lot and really loved the Dragonwell green tea. He has several poems about the tea in the area, and even a lot of the food is named after him. One huge contribution to Dragonwell that he did is he started laying the foundations for changing the name from Qiantang tea, which is just the name of the region, to Longjing tea. And so he has a calligraphy that's all about the Lao Longjing. Lao Longjing means the old dragon well, because that's where he used to go to, the temple. And he would drink tea with the monks of the Longjing temple, and eventually got that place so famous that that's where they put a lot of the ancient tea trees and the core region and everything. And so his legacy is honored not only in tea, but also in the food of Hangzhou. And what's really interesting about this is they don't need to find this poet to make Longjing famous, because the Emperor Qianlong himself came here and praised the tea. And so the fact that they're giving this poet even more respect just shows you how much this poet is respected in the history of Chinese poetry. And I agree, his poetry is incredible. It's thoughtful, genuine, sensitive, cuts right through to the human heart of any generation, of any culture, really. It's timeless. And so it's really wonderful to read these poems that were written almost 1,000 years ago and just have the exact same emotions. You know, I've heard the time has changed so fast, and yet emotionally, mentally, we're still the same humans as we were 30,000 years ago. All that kind of stuff changes slowly. And so what's really cool is seeing a poet from 1,000 years tap into that human consciousness. Anyways, I'll talk a little more about poetry later, but for now, back to the food and back to the tea. But I end up eating a whole lot of that, a whole lot of rice, and some fresh fish as well, which is really good. After this, we go down, and there's finally some room at the tea table, and we're drinking teas. And for whatever reason, I've been drinking, teas from the Tang brothers, not really brothers, but the Tang masters, and they're great teas, fantastic teas. And I'm drinking the teas here in the Jiushu tea house, and suddenly everything's much more rich. The flavors are fuller. They taste maybe it's my palate. They taste a little stronger, but I'm getting that sweetness. And then one really interesting thing is that sweetness that comes to my taste buds after a minute of drinking, it doesn't dissipate, to the point where even later that night I was laying in bed just thinking about how sweet the teas were and still tasting how sweet the teas were. And so that was my first impression why Jiushu, or Nine Trees, is really something particularly special about it. So after hanging out there for another few hours and drinking tea after tea after tea after tea, some of the stuff is chai shao. like made in a wood-fired wok, which this is the only place I saw them doing the chai shao. Everywhere else, all the woks were electric. Here they had one wok that was chai shao, and the master Zhang Hailang, he was the one that was making it, and he's my tea master's fellow student. How do I say this? They both studied together, and so they're kind of old friends, technically classmates. They call each other Shixiong, Xiongdi, all these kind of brother terms. But he was making some of these teas, and we were drinking them. And what's really interesting about the teas that are made in the chai shao wok, in the wood-fired wok, is that, well, according to traditional Chinese medicine, most green teas have a cooling effect, a cooling energy, a lot of yin energy. And so if you have yin sensitivities, it's not good for your stomach, your digestion, your organs to drink green tea. Supposedly, the teas that are made with an actual living fire in the wood-fired wok, these change the TCM properties of the tea and make it a little more neutral. And so even for people with sensitive stomachs, even for people with yin sensitivities, can drink these teas that were annealed in the fire, that yang energy fire. And I don't know, it could have an effect like that. But for me, what I definitely noticed is that they were much more, in Chinese they say chun, they say mellow, much more mellow, a little more thicker in the mouth, and a lot more complexity going on. But these are teas he's not selling. He's like, he just makes enough to give away to some friends. And I was lucky enough to have maybe 4 sessions of this tea. And maybe that was part of the reason I came back to Hangzhou and went back to the Jiushu and saw these guys multiple times, just bumming around, seeing if I could get some of that nice tea. Just a brew of it, just one brew. Another interesting thing about the conversation here in this studio is they're talking about the really terrible weather they've had this year. All the rain, the delay in picking, and Zhang is saying like he hasn't posted on WeChat in ages because there's no point. And my team master is like, what do you mean there's no point? And he's like, I don't have tea to sell. I don't want people to find me and buy my tea because I already owe 25 jin to Jiangsu and I only have 5. Today I shipped them 5 jin. I need to make another 25 and ship it there. And then other people are already asking me for more tea. And if you were there for the Biluochun episode and the last couple episodes, you know that this spring in this Zhejiang, Jiangsu area has been incredibly rainy, incredibly wet, with not a lot of good days to pick and make tea. And so we saw this in Biluochun, we're seeing this in the Westlake area, and there's just a scarcity of tea. And we'll get into this with the next person we see tomorrow. And he also is facing this kind of scarcity, but he has an entirely Chuntijong garden up behind the Hupao Chuan. And so if you remember those 4 or 5 main areas, that was the lion, the dragon, the cloud, the tiger, the plum. And today, this first day in the village, we're in the Mandrelong. Mandrelong is technically dragon, though it's also fits in with the Lion's Peak area, though it's technically in the Dragonwell vicinity if you're splitting it up into those 4 regions. Tomorrow, the next day, what we'll do is go up to the tiger, behind the tiger spring, and see this Trunti garden. Now, before I get into this hike through the running tiger spring, up the mountain, through the Hangzhou Zoo, and to the Trunti garden, I want to clarify what Trunti is. So in the Westlake area, you have 2 main cultivars, one varietal, one cultivar technically, of the Dragonwell green tea. The most common one is Dragonwell 43. This was planted a little later, maybe in the 90s, because it has a higher yield. The Chuntijong, which is the original heirloom of the area, this has a lower yield and supposedly has a different, more fuller taste. There's kind of a prejudiced saying or a snobbish saying where tea people drink Chuntijong. People who don't know tea drink 43. Again, getting into the snobbery of the area and the tea cultivars and stuff like that. But looking at some numbers. In China, the agricultural measurement is a mu. A mu is about 0.166 of an acre. And so it's not very large. It's kind of like, imagine your personal garden patch or something like that in your backyard. That would be about a mu. So a single mu of 20 bushes in one season can produce about 20 gin, which is 500 grams, so about 10 kilograms of finished tea, while a number 43 varietal can produce 25 gin. And so you get essentially a little more tea out of the 43, and everyone perceives it as a higher yield bush. And so they were just tearing out all the old varietals and planting nice little rows of 43. One interesting thing about this is you can see this from an aerial mapping. I was flying the drone through the fields, and you see the Chun-Ti-jong bushes as these nice little circles, these spherical domes of tea bushes, and then clear lines of the 43 varietal cultivar. And so it's really, really clear to see, like, okay, this area has a lot of 43, this area has a lot of Chun-Ti-jong. Somebody actually reached out to me on an email asking if aerial mapping, satellite mapping could help find tea gardens. And I initially said, like, no, most people know where the tea gardens are. But this would be a cool thing to look at the different cultivars and kind of see what percentage of what area is what. But anyways, so when somebody says they have an entirely Chun-Ti-jong field, what they mean is they have a traditional plot of land that hasn't been renovated to the new fad of the 43 cultivar. And so that was a really cool lead. And so we took this guy up on it, and we start hiking up the mountain. And what's interesting is he takes us through the zoo. And so we get into the zoo, and I'm like, where are we going? Where's your field? And we go into the zoo, and we see a lot of people with big tubs of water coming down. And I'm like, there's the Tiger Springs somewhere here. I just don't know where. But anyways, we don't go to any of the zoo exhibits, but we kind of find a little path beyond it up through the bamboo forest. And I'm like, okay, is your field somewhere here, I guess? And so we get up onto the crest, and then we start seeing all of these Chun-Ti-jong bushes. And one thing this guy says, we're just like asking him on the hike, and we're like, hey, like, so it's late March, it's almost April. How much tea have you made? And he's like, nothing. There's no tea yet. And so the Chun-Ti-jong usually is harvested a little later. And so actually talking about cultivars, there are 3 cultivars that you should be aware of. The first one is the earliest to bud. This is like mid to late February, and it's called the Wu Niu Zao. And it's like, the dark cow early or something like that. But this guy, it's very, very fat, short and fat with like really, really pretty leaves, nice little buds. And then the Dragonwell 43 pops off early March to mid-March, and it's really thin and spindly. And then the Chun-Ti comes late March, maybe mid-April even, and this is very similar to the 43, maybe not as long and slender, maybe a little thicker, but not as quite as short and stout as the Wu Niao Zao. But because of the really unfortunate weather patterns this season, this dude is not going to have a Mingqian harvest. And so he's kind of bummed out about it. And I actually right now it's May 5th. And I messaged one of our friends asking about his tea because I know she had some of it. And I was like, oh, did you try his tea? And she's like, yeah, it was great. And I'm like, okay, I'll ask if he has any. And she's like, I think he's sold out. And so it's been maybe a month, and he's already sold out of his tea, his entire season of tea. And so this year it's just been really, really hard to get the good quality teas just because there's not enough of them. Anyways, we keep hiking through his fields, and he's telling us all about the different types of different flavors you can get from the Chun-Ti-jong and why he's decided to stick with the Chun-Ti-jong. And it's a good reason, because he doesn't buy in the fad that the 43 is better than the Chun-Ti-jong. The Chun-Ti-jong has been around for, centuries and centuries, where the 43 is a modern invention. So he's a little skeptical on how it will go. And so it's really cool to see him preserving his fields for it. His name is Xie Chunhua. And I'll like to get some of his tea in the future because he's a really cool guy. He's also one of my teacher's friends. And so all of these people I've met, 2 of them, Xie Chunhua and Zhang Hailiang, these 2 guys from Jiushu, and then this guy, Xie, they're his classmates. They studied together. Were the Tong brothers. The Tong masters are just people he knows that are at the same level as him, that Dasher level. And so that shows you kind of the 4 people I met through my master in the Longjing area, in the Mandrelong village, who are making this Dragonwell green tea. So as we're hiking through from the Leaping Tiger, from the Running Tiger Spring, we crest the ridge, and at that crest, I see the Baihefeng. And so the Baihefeng literally stands right between the Running Tiger area and the Shifeng area. Though technically it's in the Manjue Long village. And so I'm asking these people, and they're like, well, it's kind of all in this really specific area. And so like it's hard to draw a really clean line between like what is, the tiger and what is the dragon and what is the lion. So anyways, everything kind of blends together. It's not a big area at all. Like the Baihefeng I was talking about, they only have about 660 mu in that area, which comes to just under 110 acres of tea fields. And so imagine 110 acres of tea fields trying to meet a demand as high as all of China and Europe and America. Naturally, this is just the Baihefeng area. And yet, if you see anything from this region, it should be incredibly expensive. Otherwise, it's definitely fake. Just because, as we know in the West, and as we've heard in the Chinese, wu yi xi wei gui, which is scarcity increases the value of a product. And the more rare it is, the more expensive it is. And usually when you're looking for these really authentic teas, as much as I don't want to say it, the price tag is a huge clue if you're getting the real deal or the wrong deal. But sometimes, naturally, you can fake a price very easily. You just raise the price and like, oh, people will think it's, original Longjing from Shifeng because it has the right price. But it's so it's not really the end-all be-all as far as the deciding factor. A few other things to look at are the shape of the leaves. You want that long, slender leaf, and usually they're not really pretty, these handmade, masterful teas. You also want that orchid fragrance, that really floral fragrance, not overly chestnutty. And then that secret where you begin to salivate, you begin to get all that sweetness after a few cups, after a few infusions, after a few minutes of drinking the teas. All right, it looks like I'm kind of running out of time here. I wanted to talk a little more about the production, about my time in the Jiushu and the 9 trees and the people I met there, but I'll do that in the next episode, okay? I'll talk in the next episode about how they make Dragonwell and about the people surrounding this whole process. So in this episode, what I did is I talked about the Manjue Long village. I talked about the Westlake area. I talked about the 5 main production regions in the Westlake area. That's the Shi, Hu, Yun, Long, and Mei. The tiger, the lion, the dragon, the cloud, and the plum. And I talked about how the plum, the Meijiawu village, produces most of the Dragonwell in this scenic area, maybe 80% to 20%. And then the rest of the 20%, it's split up between those 4 regions. I talked about the 2 different cultivars, the number 43, which produces a higher yield, and the original cultivar, heirloom cultivar, the Chuntijong, which is the tea for people who drink tea, if you know what I mean. I talked about my tea master and his 4 friends. So first there was Tang Xiaojun. Tang Xiaojun was that guy at the peak of the mountain, at the freaking top. And he's just got the attitude, he's got the demeanor, and he's got really good teas. And a whole lot of respect from the whole tea community in China here. And his teas, as I mentioned, are beautiful. They're everything you want out of a really, really good Shifeng Dragonwell. Next, we have his friend, the other Tang Hejun. And so their names are different. Tang is similar, but the Drun is different. The first Drun is the Drun of an army, the little army, Tang little army. And the second one is Tang Hejun, which is Tang Crane Gentleman, if you're looking at the translated characters. And this guy is the Taoist of the 2, where he's more relaxed. He has an incredible equanimity, where he's always just chill and relaxed and happy. And he makes teas that are very traditional, teas that don't look the most beautiful, but do taste fantastically good. Next, we saw my friends at the Jiushu, and this is Zhang Hailiang. And these are the teas I absolutely love. These are the teas I ended up buying for myself and buying to source. And he's the one who was doing the Chai Shao walk, the wood-fired walk for Dragonwell, which I've never seen before in any of the areas. And everyone here that I talked to in this tea house knew so much about Chinese tea culture, and they lived and breathed it, and it was really refreshing to see. they weren't just talking about Dragonwell. They had a guy from Wuishan there who had just been staying there for a few weeks, and they were sampling different types of white teas, aged white teas, and comparing if it was real or fake or something like that. Again, a lot of my trips and stories are up on the Instagram, the One River Tea Instagram. I save them to the story highlight reels, so check that out if you're interested in seeing faces to all of these names. The last guy, Xie Chunhua, this guy was really cool with his traditional bushes, but I've never got to taste any of his teas. He sampled me some from last year, but it was, last year's tea this spring doesn't taste so good. But anyways, thank you guys for coming on this trip. In the next episode, I'll continue my path through this mountain. I'll talk about the people I meet. I'll talk about the production of Dragonwell in this region. And maybe discuss a little more about the quotas, how much tea can be produced, how much tea is produced, how much tea is sold in China and the West. Because Dragonwell the water gets really deep here, and so I could talk a lot about it. I've barely given you just the surface information here. I could go deeper and deeper, but we have a lot more tea to talk about in these next episodes. I just got back from Anhui with Alex, and we found a whole lot of really beautiful yellow teas that we want to do a whole episode on. So I've had Alex start writing that, and he can give you a whole lot of information because he's really into the history of it and understands like the Chinese side of things. So again, stay tuned next episode about the making of Dragonwell in the Manchuilong village and all my friends at Jiushu. So again, thanks for catching this episode of Tea Soup. This is Derek from One River Tea, and until next time, brew happy.